Hi, and welcome back to our virtual classroom. I hope that these videos are of some help to you. I hope that they're at least a little more interesting than the ones that I recorded right before spring break. And I'm glad you're here. I'm glad everything seems to be going reasonably well. I appreciate all of the efforts that you've made to participate in the forums, and so I think at least given what we have to work with, it seems to be going reasonably well. Okay, so this is the first video of the series for Chapter 7 of the shell text, which is called Blocking New Entrants and Border Patrols. And so this will be, we're going to do 6 videos this time. I broke it up into 6 instead of, I think we had 8 or 9 last time. And instead of doing a welcome video plus an introduction video, I'm just doing the both in one. So the videos, the parts, will follow the elements of the outline, which is available on Sakai. And the slides are also available on Sakai. Okay, so the quote from this chapter is that the only effective barriers to entry are those created by government. And what's interesting about this quote is when we think about barriers to entry, we often think about things like the cost of tooling or design. Some industries, it's very expensive to produce a competing product, like airliners, for example. There's enormous barriers to entry to competing with Boeing and Airbus for commercial airliners. So that's what we think of often as a barrier to entry. But the point of this quote is that those barriers to entry are not as effective as those created by the government. So when the government creates a law or a rule or a regulation that restricts the industry, that is sometimes a more effective barrier to entry than even the inherent cost of entering an expensive business. Okay, so let's talk about where we are in this chapter in the book, and we are in part 2, and this is Porter's 5 forces, which we've been coming back to at each chapter. And so we are now, we did in chapter 6, we did the industry rivals, so we dealt with the center of the circle, and this time we're looking to the left of the circle, which is the threat of new entrants, and what sort of blocking techniques can be used by using the legal system to prevent new entrants into the market. Okay, I actually think that the first sentence of chapter 7 is more interesting as a quote than the quote that they used at the top, although I still think it's interesting. But the first sentence says that vigorous competition is a great idea unless you are trying to make a profit. Now think about that for a second. Our entire system is built on a capitalist competitive market, but a true involved, very robust competition pushes prices down. And so it's difficult to make a profit when you have very vigorous competition, particularly for something that's commoditized. So what this points out is that if you really want to make profits, if you want to protect your profits, you need to restrict competition in some way, which seems sort of anti-American, certainly anti-competitive. All right. And it's important to know that companies of all sizes play this game. This is not a game just for the big players. This is small businesses, medium businesses. They're all trying to do what they can to restrict the amount of competition that they have to face. Some strategies are much more subtle than others, which are much more direct. We are always worrying, and we'll see that in this chapter, about antitrust. So one of the themes that you'll see of some of the stories is that there is often, usually, a cover story and then a real story behind the cover story. So health and safety is often given as an example for some of these proposed market blocking regulations, but the real reason that they're there is to either reduce competition or protect pricing that already exists. And what we find is that there's not really that much of a threat that's required sometimes to engage in this activity. So companies will often use blocking strategies just on kind of the hint of possible competition. And we'll see some examples of that. And we see that in the first example, which is the little snack stand outside the Washington Redskins practice facility. That was a great example of the use of health and safety as an argument for why they were trying to shut down these kids' little snack stand. They were arguing that, you know, they didn't have the health permits to sell food safely. But the real reason that the Redskins shut down the little kids' snack stand was that there was a licensee who was paying to sell concessions in the stadium during the practice, and they wanted to protect their prices. So I also have here a clip. If you haven't seen it, I don't know if you're a South Park fan. And if you are offended by things, don't watch it. South Park is very offensive, but also very funny if you're not offended by things. I mean, they basically offend everybody, and then that's how they avoid getting in trouble for being offensive. But they did a whole episode it's actually based on a trademark case where the Washington Redskins, at least for a period of time, had lost the rights to their trademark. And Cartman starts a business called the Washington Redskins and just uses all of their trademarks because there's no restriction against it. So it's a really funny episode. I highly recommend it, again, as long as you're not offended easily, or not even easily. The South Park people offend pretty aggressively, and they, hold no punches. Another example of a good reason and a real reason that comes from the book is the steel tariffs during the George W. Bush administration. So the cover story there was that the tariffs were designed to protect the existing industry from a dumping of cheap imported steel. Now the reality was the domestic industry couldn't produce enough supply to meet the domestic demand, but so the real reason that these regulations were put in place were to protect the profits and the prices of the domestic manufacturers who had a higher cost than the foreign manufacturers. But also, the other thing which is important to know in this story is that these were states that were important politically to the Bush administration. So that is an important aspect of how some of this business gets done. And some of these companies are very smart about how they do this. Boeing, for example, all of the military manufacturers are famous for this, locating parts in as many states as they can. They build the wing in one place and they build the tail in another place. They spread out the contract manufacturing, and the reason they do that is every state where they have a plant, they have 2 senators that are interested in the jobs and the economic benefits that those plants bring. And so that's why the political aspect of this really can't be ignored, and that's, I think, an important part of the steel tariff story. So there are 3 forms of barriers that Shell points out. The first is what he calls the regulatory fortresses. This is where you're blocking new entrants by enforcing existing restrictions. So one of the things I think that you may have noticed as we've gone through this material is there's a difference between a rule that is passed by Congress or by an administrative agency and a rule that is actually enforced, or the degree to which it is enforced. So sometimes what some of these companies just do is they don't need to actually have a new rule created. They just make sure that the rules that exist, even if they don't really have logic behind them anymore, they're outdated or whatever, but they're still on the books and they advocate for enforcement. So you see this in customs and fair trade rules and that sort of thing. Then the other strategy, so that's the regulatory firewall. The other strategy is using litigation as a firewall. So suing, using the legal system for this. And there's two major ways that there's a major way that the incumbents do this is either threatening or actually suing a possible entrant into a new market. And sometimes it's just, as we'll see in some of the examples, like in the mall example, it's just for delay. Sometimes all they really need to do is delay the new entrant for long enough to protect their market or to get a competing or a better product on the market. So litigation sometimes has, and I would say often, the strategy behind it is not necessarily to win, but it is to drag things out, to incur costs on the other side, and to protect a space. And then the last is something we've been talking a lot about, which is lobbying, using the access to the government to create new regulation. So the regulatory fortress, the first of these three, is using existing regulations. This last one is creating new ones, advocating for, lobbying for the creation of new protections for existing incumbents. And so the rest of the chapter is structured around not those three topics. We'll cover each one of those, but over the different types of barriers or areas of barriers that exist. So the first one is local geographic barriers as an area of protection. The second one is geopolitical barriers or boundaries. And the third is global, the WTO. And then the last one is, those are all by geography. This last one is more by market or by product segment. And so we're going to look at each of those in succession. Okay, that's all I have for this first video. What questions do you have? Have you ever seen an example of a market being blocked by an incumbent of unnecessarily high prices? There's a ton of examples, so I'd be interested to hear what examples you have in the forums. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the video number 2. Thanks.